Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've been pretty busy working our way through the lead up to the Pequot War. We've been introduced to a host of characters on all sides of the issues for the last several weeks. And the fact is, the strained relations on all fronts were coming to a head. We covered one of the critical pieces that fell right into place last week as we talked about the Saybrook Conference of July 1636, a failed conference that officially ended the Treaty of 1634 between the English and the Pequot Nation. And we closed in part with this, quote, "What we've seen this week is the advancement of the Puritans into Connecticut almost unchallenged as they gained a foothold in Wethersfield, Windsor, Hartford, and Saybrook. We've seen the official fracture of the Treaty of 1634 and the return of Pequot gifts. We've seen the anger and wisdom of Lyon Gardner and the steadfastness of the Massachusetts Bay leadership in demanding what they believed to be within their rights. We've also seen that the rhetoric had turned to action through the conference at Saybrook. And that rhetoric and those actions would only escalate a very tense situation. It was not long after this conference that another Englishman would die at the hands of the natives. Not the Pequots, but the Narragansetts. But the Pequots would bear the brunt of the consequences. It was about to get very ugly." End quote. And so it will this week. We'll work through a couple more scenarios that occurred just after Saybrook that really ignited the Connecticut region and set into motion the series of events that culminated in all-out war. Before we get started today, I want to encourage you to listen to the narrative with two separate foci. One is the narrative itself, what actually happens. But the other is the concept of a clash of cultures. Not in the physical sense, that's going to be coming soon, but more in the diplomatic sense, hey, there's norms that we live by that should seem obvious to everybody. Or the flip side to that concept, which is why didn't it occur to the English to try to look at the events through the lens of the natives? Bear in mind, I'm not asking that so much in a wondering or a naive sense as much as an accusational sense. Once again, the Pequots would be forced into bad decisions and actions based on the situations they were faced with, situations provoked, in large part, by their enemies and greed. Like so many areas of history or specific historical events, the storyline today is a homogenized picture, the blending of several narratives. Some of the events are a little cloudy. A lot of the narrative is dependent on an English perspective, and that's fine, but it also tends to paint a slanted view of the events. At the end of the day, it seems like the Pequots were not going to be allowed to win. There's two events that we're going to discuss today that happened within a few weeks of the failed Saybrook Conference in rapid succession. Frankly, it kind of amazes me in those days with the technology and the ability to travel that they did, how fast these guys could get down to business when they had to. So the first event we're going to look at is the Pequot attempt to trade with Saybrook. And the second event, where we'll spend most of the time today, is developing the murder of John Oldham. If there was a proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, that was it. And from there was no turning back. So the conference at Saybrook had failed. The ties had been cut. The Pequots had nothing to do but wait to see how the English would play their hand. After all, it was not the Pequots but the English that had severed relations. And whether they had options is really up to the individual observer. I personally think that they did. But like I said, a lot of the narrative today is a homogenized look at the situation from several sources that tell a similar story with certain nuances added based on the time frame that it was written and the author's personal choice of what to highlight and what not to highlight. And this first part, however, is a unique part of the story that I'm relaying from Alfred A. Cave's The Pequot War. It's a great book. It definitely fits the storyline, but he developed a precursor to the John Oldham affair that helps to frame the overall atmosphere at the time in Connecticut. And I do think the Pequots failed to understand the direness of their situation with the English. I mean, from an Algonquin perspective, things could be fixed. I mean, as we talked about last week, things may already have been perceived as fixed from a Pequot perspective. But from an English perspective, things were as hopeless as the abandoned Treaty of 1634. Maybe they just did not understand the native perspective. Maybe they didn't care what that was. Maybe they just wanted a pretense to justify aggression. Whatever the rationale, we can only speculate. The narratives and the accounts that we have answer some questions, but they do fail to fully explain the details that somebody must have known back then, that a lot of people probably knew back then, but failed to leave an accurate record of. So almost immediately after Saybrook, the Pequots continued to seek peace and trade with the English. With Massachusetts Bay obviously out of the question for the time being, they took a chance with Saybrook. Now remember, these guys had been the tough guys for a long time, the Pequots, I mean. But they were in the midst of a devastating smallpox epidemic. They had lost their main sachem, Tadelbem. They had internal leadership challenges, which were going to develop within the next few weeks. And they were under a shaky, brokered peace with the Narragansett. They were through with the Dutch. They were through with Massachusetts Bay for the time being. And with Massachusetts Bay, presumably, all of the Puritan colonies and colonials. Except that Saybrook, although Puritan, was not necessarily under the thumb of Boston as everybody else seemed to be. Saybrook had been especially planned and set aside, you recall, for some of the leading Puritans in English society. It was a colony whose patent had been issued by the Council for New England and was meant to be, in part, feudal in its design. So their concept of colonization was different at Saybrook. And if you'll recall also, when young John Winthrop Jr. had arrived to be governor of Saybrook, he simply declared that he was now in charge of all of Connecticut. That's an interesting thing. That's an interesting claim. That demonstrates the kind of men that held the patent and the attitude, the bravado these men apparently sent their governor to Connecticut with. Men like Oliver Cromwell, by the way. So the Pequots, I don't know if they realized any of the politics involved here or not, made an offer to Saybrook for trade. And Lyon Gardner, the engineer and military leader of Saybrook, was on his own at this point. The delegation from Massachusetts Bay was gone. Governor Winthrop, he left, and he wasn't going to be returning. So it was Lyon's call, and here's what happened, according to Alfred A. Cave. The Pequots sent a messenger to Saybrook. Now his name was Comathus, and he was fluent in English and claimed to have lived in Plymouth for a while, so he would have been familiar with English ways. And he told the folks at Saybrook that Saussicus, the now main sachem of the Pequot nation, was still willing to trade with the English. And he had a deal for them. Apparently, he had come into the possession of 2 stray English horses, and he promised to return them if the English would send a trade delegation. Now, I got a question for you at this point. After all that's happened in the recent past between these groups, how would you feel about that offer? If you're Lyon Gardner, how would you feel? Would you trust it? If you're Comathus, I mean, he knew the English. How would you feel about making this trip to Saybrook? And if you're Saussicus, I mean, you're getting squeezed from all sides at this point. How badly do you want to trade with Saybrook? How badly do you want to open up European trade with any other colony that'll talk to you? How on guard would you be? And think about the men under him, young, testosterone-driven warriors. I mean, the Pequots at this point had lost a lot of people, but they were also concentrated now into 2 main villages. They still had hundreds and hundreds of warriors. They were strong in this area. They were dangerous. I mean, there must have been a lot of pride mixed with a lot of humble pie at this point. I mean, just a few years ago, nobody would have ever challenged them. Now they're begging to trade with the English, whom they allowed to settle in their lands. It seems like there must have been a lot of grief and anger, fear and trepidation, uncertainty. You remember there had been a counter voice to all of the paranoia, though, a counter English voice, an alternative voice leading up to the conference. An English trader that had warned Lyon Gardner not to believe everything that he heard. Remember, a lot of those rumors are believed to have come from Uncas, the dissatisfied ex-Pequot, now leader of the Mohegans. So if you'll remember, that trader's name was William Pynchon, and he had a warehouse full of goods, and he was willing to trade. So Comathus encouraged him to bring some merchandise to the Pequot village, and there they would buy the English goods and return the horses. Lyon Gardner was skeptical, but he did want to keep the peace as long as possible. You remember, he knew he was very vulnerable in that lone outpost. So he eventually agreed to send a small party to trade. The party consisted of a man named Thomas Hurlbut, a Sergeant Tilley, there's 3 other unnamed men, and William Pynchon's warehouse manager, who happened to be a young man named Stephen Winthrop. And you guessed it, another Winthrop, the Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop Sr.'s son, the departed governor of Saybrook, John Jr.'s brother. The Winthrops are an interesting family, aren't they? They seem to be involved in everything, pretty much everywhere. So anyways, this trading party was dispatched with strict instructions from Lyon Gardner. He told them that they were to stay in the middle of the river, and they were not to go ashore until the trading was done, and they were to stay in the boat and direct the natives to come 1 canoe at a time with no more than 4 men to a canoe, and they were to always remain armed. They were to stay only 1 day, and they were to leave before sundown. And if they did happen to recover the horses, they were to, quote, take them in at a clear piece of land at the mouth of the river, sending only 2 men ashore, end quote, to retrieve them while the others stood guard. They didn't listen to these instructions. In fact, after the fact, Lyon Gardner recorded that they told him, in all of the excitement, they had simply forgotten. They reported that upon arrival, the Pequots did not appear hostile. I always find that interesting. Well, he didn't look dangerous. I mean, as if someone's got danger tattooed on their forehead, right? I mean, if people appeared hostile, then none of us would ever actually get hurt because we'd know who to avoid. So that in and of itself shows a little bit of naivete or arrogance on their part. But they also were not going to trade the way Lyon Gardner had instructed his men. The Pequots weren't. They weren't going to send 1 canoe at a time with just 4 guys. I mean, you can't blame them, right? The Europeans were treacherous. Once the natives came aboard so many of those vessels, going back at least 30 years just from this podcast series. I mean, over and over and over again, you're seeing Europeans just steal natives. Not to mention the recent troubles that everyone was so familiar with right here in this particular example. So, like some meeting of gang leaders or mafiosos, right? Everybody's on edge and nobody trusts anybody, but there's this necessity, there's a compulsion to meet and to conduct business. I can imagine that tension level on all sides was high. So they sent 2 men ashore. And I believe this must have been Sassacus's village. If so, it was loaded with warriors. In another couple of episodes, we're going to talk about the concentration of Pequots at this point. They had really concentrated themselves to 2 villages, and I believe the village that the traders had come to was Sassacus's. That's where the majority of the warriors were located. So if that's the case, and I'm these traders, I'd have been a little nervous. I don't think I'd have been the guy to volunteer to go to shore. I don't think I'd have been a guy you could have made go to shore, in all honesty. So while Sergeant Tilley was setting up a camp of sorts, Thomas Hurlbut, armed, walked right into the Sacob's wigwam and asked for the horses. That was stupid. That's bold, belligerent at best. I mean, here again, if the Pequots wanted to harm these guys, they would have been dead, right? This action alone could have spooked an unplanned response. I mean, it's not very smart. It's very provocative. But the Pequots actually fled at the sudden appearance of an armed Englishman barging into the wigwam. It's interesting, the only one who did not flee was a woman named Wincombone, and that was the Sacom's wife, I believe Sassacus's. What she did was make hand gestures that Hurlbut perceived to be threats. He thought it might be a sign that he could lose his head. So he turns and he runs from the wigwam with sword drawn, yelling for Tilley. Picture that scene. I mean, what would you have done? You're in the middle of this village and you're running through it armed, and the guy that you're with, presumably by the river shore, setting up like this little camp. What do you think he thought? So, I mean, even if the Pequots had meant no harm, zero harm when they came ashore, this type of erratic behavior could understandably get a guy or two killed, or maybe a whole trading party. What would you have done if you were Tilly? I mean, I won't hold you in suspense. Apparently, he emptied his pot of water that he'd been heating up, and he ran for the boat. I mean, the historical notation was made that he put the pot on his head. What was this for? Defense? I mean, it just sounds silly to me. If he was heating the pot, it must have been hot. So I have no idea what he was doing. I can tell you, though, I probably would have left the pot right where it was. I wouldn't have wasted any time getting out of there. Well, these two guys, they kept running and then presumably swimming all the way back to the boat. And the Pequots, for their part, did give chase to the water's edge, but then they broke the chase off and they simply yelled for the guys to come back and trade. We really don't know what Wincombe meant with her gesture. We don't even know what gesture she made. It could have been a warning to Hurlbut against him being violent. I mean, he did rush in and surprise them. He was armed. It could have been an uncomfortable joke to lighten the mood. I mean, maybe about the fear of her own people as they ran away when he came in. We don't know. But it does seem apparent to me that there was no threat to these guys whatsoever. I mean, if there had been, they would never have made it out of there. I think just the opposite is true here. The Pequot showed enormous restraint. Think about it, especially if you're a male listening to this. And not that females can't, get all up in arms and little frayed around the edges, but think about if you're a male, the testosterone running through your veins when you were in your 20s, and you're with a bunch of your buddies and a much smaller group than the group you're with, kind of freaks out a little bit. I mean, you'd have no fear from them whatsoever. You may actually take care of business if you thought they may be a threat to you. That's kind of the way I see this. We'll find out in a few episodes that if this is Sausakis's village, there was up to like 700 warriors living here at the time. This was not the time and the place to run through like a maniac, armed with weapons. I think Hurlbut's actions were obnoxious. I do think it shows the tension that was in the air, though. So he acted like this after they had already demanded limited interaction at the boat for trade. I mean, to me, the English did not show good faith toward their hosts at all. Their hosts showed incredible restraint toward them. Or they were very comfortable and felt very secure in their village with so many warriors around. I don't know. But to me, it's amazing that the English weren't slaughtered right then and there. The fact is, we don't really know what happened, what the motive was of Wincombe. We do know that Lyon Gardner was very concerned when he heard the report. He fed into the fear like the others, like William Pynchon had warned him not to do. His official report stated there was at least no outward sign of violence directed toward the men. Maybe William Pynchon was right. Maybe they should just not have bought into the hype. But they did. Just days, maybe a couple of weeks later, on July 20th, another English trader named John Gallup was en route to Long Island on a small vessel with a crew of 3 to trade. And unexpectedly, he was blown toward Block Island with a strong wind. And as he approached, he saw a pinnace that he recognized. He knew that it was John Oldham's, another trader. And he called to the vessel, but nobody answered, and there was no John Oldham in sight. What he did see was a lot of activity on the deck and a canoe with 14 natives loaded with merchandise heading toward shore. Now, just a quick overview. We've talked about John Oldham before, who he was. For starters, he was an experienced trader. He had arrived in the country in 1623, and he had a lot of experience with the natives of several tribes. They were not always good experiences, but lately he had kind of come into his own. You remember in 1633 and 1634, he opened up the Connecticut frontier and both explored the region and helped to settle Wethersfield, Pequot country. He had also later challenged the Pequots about fulfilling their end of the Treaty of 1634. Now, also in 1634, which happens to have been a busy year for John Oldham, He was trading with the Narragansetts as well. Now, that time had not gone as smoothly as others. It seems that the Narragansetts had promised 1,000 bushels of corn, but their crops had not produced as expected, and so they cut that number in half. There's speculation that bad feelings emerged here and that his death had something to do with that time. I don't think that's true. As we'll see, that narrative doesn't add up. But we do know that the Narragansetts had given Oldham 500 bushels of corn and offered to give him an island on Narragansett Bay to live on. So it doesn't seem like they wanted to kill him. It seems like they wanted to be friends with him. They'd also given refuge to Roger Williams and were getting along quite well with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Oldham's experience among the English colonies had gone about the same way as the natives, so it hadn't always gone well. At the time of his death, however, he was well respected within Massachusetts Bay. Now, again, it hadn't always been that way. Years before, he had been associated with Fernando Gorges. You remember him, the anti-Puritan, pro-Anglican guy with great influence over the Council for New England. And he had been partnered up with Governor John Mason, and they had been developing a lot of the area in today's Canada, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and they were moving south. You remember he was the guy that was trying to dislodge the Puritans from the power base of Massachusetts Bay. So Oldham hadn't been that popular with the Puritans at that point, but by this time, his reputation had recovered. And as of late, he had been working with Massachusetts Bay in an official capacity and had been rewarded with a huge land grant. He had special business relations with the Winthrops as well. He'd been a part of the Saybrook Conference, I believe, as we talked about last week. I think he was there as a special envoy to John Winthrop Sr. himself. So, needless to say, his murder was a big deal, a much bigger deal than John Stone's had been a few years earlier. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding the final days or weeks of John Oldham's life. But here's what we do know. After the failed conference at Saybrook, Oldham had returned to Wethersfield, but a couple of weeks later he left for Block Island to trade. And he stopped first at Saybrook, where it was verified that he had a crew of 4 with him, 2 Narragansetts and 2 English boys, may have actually been his sons. So again, largely from Alfred Cave, Gallup reported that upon his calling out and approaching Oldham's pinnace, that the natives left on board, who were not sailors, quote, let slip and set sail, being 2 miles from the shore, end quote. They may have outnumbered his crew, but the natives handled the vessel very badly in the wind. So Gallup, fearing the worst, moved in. And what he did here is masterful. The odds were definitely not in his favor, except that he had English guns and was a skilled navigator. Now just imagine this scene. This would be pretty cool in a movie. Basically, it starts out, it's 14 natives against 4 Englishmen. And the 4 have but a small boat. So the first thing they did was shower the deck with duckshot. The natives dove for the hatches. Then Gallup moved away, but caught a good wind and actually ended up ramming Oldham's boat. And it almost capsized. Now imagine, it's just 2 miles out from shore, so they're not exactly close to anything. And the natives on board were terrified. I mean, I would be too. I mean, between the strafing of duckshot and the ramming of the boat, 6 of them jumped into the water and drowned. Now, the odds were still not in his favor, so he again moved away. And then, quote, planting his anchor in its stern, he crashed into it again. The anchor held firmly in the bow, and so, sticking fast to her, he raked the deck again with duckshot, end quote. He broke loose and moved away again. I mean, really, when you think about it, this could be a great scene in a movie. I imagine the scurrying natives once the terrorizers now being terrorized. Some kind of poetic justice being played out. I mean, when you think about it, Gallup acted pretty smart right here, pretty masterfully. So at any rate, another 4 or 5 natives abandoned the ship and drowned. So it's now 4 against 4. The odds are significantly better. I mean, the English definitely had the upper hand. 1 native emerged and surrendered immediately, and he was tied up and placed in the hold. Another surrendered and was tied up, but they feared that the two would work together, break free, and attack them, so they simply threw him overboard, bound. That's an awful way to die. But that's just one more shrewd move on the part of Gallop, if you ask me. And that could not have been an encouragement to the remaining two men hiding on board Oldham's boat. So they barricaded themselves into a small room with swords. Trying to extract them may have been dangerous to Gallop and his crew, so they left them barricaded. They searched the boat, and Oldham's body was found naked and mutilated. It was still warm. And it was said, quote, his head cleft to the brains, and his hands and legs cut as if they had been cutting them off, end quote. Gallop was running out of time. Night was coming. So he unloaded the rest of the cargo, or as much as he could, that was left and took the sails. He abandoned the attempt to tow the pinnace, and so he let it go adrift, and it ended up in Narragansett Bay, with the two natives still held up in the small room. So for now, anyways, they'd gotten away. This was an interesting turn of events. This was not in the middle of nowhere. It was somewhere. It was Block Island. This was the home of the Eastern Niantic, and they were tributaries of the Narragansett. This was a big deal. It could bring a very destructive force against the Narragansetts, and they knew it. Canonicus and Mayantonomo, the two co-main sachems of the Narragansetts, acted very quickly. Now, we've talked about Canonicus a few times in the past. He was a great nemesis of Massasoit, if you recall. He was also the chief enemy of the Pequots and a loyal ally of the English, and the head of the Narragansetts, arguably second only to the Pequots for regional supremacy. We'll develop these two guys, Canonicus and Mayantonomo, a little bit more in a couple of episodes. Mayantonomo will eventually square off against another character that we've not fully developed yet, but mentioned, that being Uncas, a skilled sachem who would contribute to the ruin of many people. Now, one thing that appears certain amongst all the uncertainty of this violence, Canonicus and Mayantonomo did not know anything about this attack. It was done without their knowledge. I mean, that fact alone probably saved their lives. Not long after the murder, two natives who had worked for John Oldham arrived in Boston with a Narragansett entourage. Roger Williams had written a letter on their behalf telling the Massachusetts Bay magistrates that the Narragansetts were very troubled by this murder, that Mayantonomo had actually been dispatched to Block Island with 200 men to deal with the perpetrators of the crime. Massachusetts Bay was not completely dependent upon the actions of Canonicus and Mayantonomo, nor were they dependent on the information that came through the letter from Roger Williams. They had interrogated the prisoner that had been brought in by John Gallop, and he had loose lips. The prisoner had reported that all the Narragansett sachems had been in on the plot except for the two main sachems. And that was later disproven. I mean, it was not all, although several were implicated, but not all of the Narragansett sachems. He also said that the reason was that Oldham had been dealing with the Pequots. Now, historically, that may have been a legitimate reason at some point in the past, but at this point, the two groups had had a truce, and they had a truce that had been negotiated and brokered by the English. And also, more recently, John Oldham had been invited again, remember, to live among the Narragansetts. I mean, they offered him an island in their bay. So it would appear that some of that information may have been sketchy, or at least it's difficult to make that hold up. I mean, the fact is, there are several scenarios that were raised, but there was never one that really made sense that could tie everything together. Anyway, another thing that they learned was that the two natives employed by Oldham had been in on the plot. They had made sure that the timing was right, that Oldham was where he was supposed to be. Those two guys were the same guys that were in Boston at this specific time delivering the letter from Roger Williams with the Narragansett entourage. That part, the prisoner told them, happened to be true. But diplomacy is a strange thing. Diplomacy commands strange rules. It necessitates strange rules. I mean, one way or another, Groups, even those hostile to one another, have to be able to communicate. So the magistrates let them go because they were acting as official diplomats for the Narragansetts. They kind of had diplomatic immunity. But once they left Boston, they were no longer acting as diplomats. And so they would no longer have to be extended the courtesy of a diplomatic immunity. So it was on July 26th, Governor Vane sent a letter to Roger Williams. July 26th. All of this happened in a matter of a few weeks total. Really a few days since Oldham's death, but a few weeks. It sure seems like it's all moving way too fast, spiraling out of control. So anyway, Governor Vane wanted Roger Williams to demand the English boys' return. He expected Canonicus to take revenge. He warned Williams that this whole thing could escalate into all-out war and warned him to take care in that event. So Vane's expecting the worst here. I mean, the Narragansetts weren't out of the woods yet. If that was the case, if war came, Roger Williams, theoretically, was about as vulnerable as Lyon Gardner was at Saybrook. You remember the level of concern that Lyon Gardner had. He's a trained military guy. I mean, it must be nice to breathe threats and fire from a distance, right? I mean, Boston was pretty far removed from the real danger zone. Boston was in the midst of manipulating everybody to get what they wanted, control of the wampum trade. And they were willing to put everybody at risk. Now, Governor Vane also wrote a letter to Canonicus directly. He was blunt and he pulled no punches. He told Canonicus that he had let the two natives go when they were in Boston because they had come on a diplomatic mission, but he was now demanding their return to Boston. He must have been stewing over this for a while. I mean, think about it. As a side note here, around this time, the Pequots were entreating the Narragansetts to join them in an all-out war against the English. They could see what was coming. It was worth a shot, right? I mean, they may have been longtime enemies, but teaming up with an enemy would beat dying or national extermination. And as a side note, don't lose sight of the other things that were going on at this point. The tension of the Roger Williams controversy and soon to be the Anne Hutchinson controversy, the smallpox epidemic, the ever-growing Puritan population arriving in Massachusetts Bay, the issues with the Dutch, and on it goes. There's a lot going on here. So at any rate, the two English boys were returned to Boston, as well as a lot of the stolen merchandise. But the letter writing back and forth kind of interests me. I mean, Massachusetts Bay was theological and legalistic, but they hadn't shown a lot of diplomacy. Not to me. I mean, think about how they had or would deal with the Dutch, just from what we talked about in this series. How had they dealt with the Dutch? Or even with their fellow English colony, Plymouth, right? Or the Pequots, or Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, Reverend Wheelwright, Governor Vane, John Underhill. I mean, these are just folks that we have talked about in this podcast. It's a tough thing to build a civilization, to keep order, to organize for growth, to expand and to spread out, all of the while protecting your long-term interests. So the boys and the stuff were returned, but the Narragansetts said nothing about the two natives that had been demanded. No response whatsoever. Now, Roger Williams conducted his own investigation. Remember, he was close with the Narragansetts. He found that a number of the Sachems were involved, but not, again, the two main Sachems, and not all of the Sachems. As a matter of fact, 3 of the natives that had drowned when Gallop rammed the boat that day were Sachems. Now, this knowledge prompted one more response or demand from Massachusetts Bay toward the Narragansetts. They demanded the Sachems that were involved. The 2 workers for John Oldham were no longer enough. The return of the 2 English boys was not enough. They wanted everybody involved. Ultimately, the Narragansetts would report that all the guilty parties were killed but 2. They were said to have fled to the Pequots, where they received sanctuary. Like the Pequots need any more bad press right now, right? So a few weeks later, the English sent an envoy to the Narragansetts to ensure that they did not form an alliance with the Pequots. they never did form that alliance. I mean, they must have weighed their options and figured that the English were more than likely to come out on top. So upon reflection, this event, the murder of John Oldham, is strange. It does not have a clear-cut rationale behind it. All the obvious scenarios fall apart under scrutiny. I mean, the one that seems most reasonable is Oldham's efforts to develop the trade with the Pequots. But again, he'd been doing that for a while, and he wasn't in charge of that. John Winthrop Sr. was. The peace treaty had been negotiated by Winthrop, not Oldham. And then there was the smallpox epidemic that began in 1633. It devastated the Pequots, but it also took a lot of Narragansetts. And it was supposed that the Dutch had brought that accidentally, but Canonicus was always suspicious of how that started, always wondered if it was on purpose, and John Oldham had been in the area about the same time. So, at any rate, John Oldham had been in good standing with the Narragansetts officially when he was killed. There's a lot of questions around this incident, a lot of questions about how it was investigated, how its details were preserved. And Francis Jennings brings up some really good observations about this whole situation. I mean, to begin with, although not every Sachem was involved, there were several. So this was not just a local murder on Block Island. And Jennings described it as, quote, a state execution, end quote. Because of the number of people involved and the distances some of them must have traveled, the trouble that they took to be there, to be a part of this. I mean, somebody knew what happened and exactly why, but that information was never left for posterity. What is known is that John Winthrop Sr. did interview on at least 2 separate occasions 5 eyewitnesses to the crime. You have the 2 natives that were in the employment of John Oldham, you have the 2 English boys that were on the boat, and you have the prisoner. And oddly, so on at least 2 occasions, 5 interviews, those interview notes have been lost with the exception of the comment that the prisoner said the murder was because of Oldham's dealings with the Pequots. Then why all the fanfare from all of these other people? The fact that the boys were spared in Algonquin culture could be indicative of an execution for a particular crime that Oldham had committed. I mean, they didn't just kill the boys too. But the prisoner also reported that all the Sachems except the 2 main Sachems had been involved. But there were others that were later sufficiently cleared. So not exactly 100% trustworthy, if we can believe the English accounts of his interrogations. So the question remains, why was John Oldham killed? Why were there no official notes of those proceedings and interviews from John Winthrop? Remember, there were no notes preserved at the Saybrook Conference either. I mean, we go by hearsay and by conjecture and by piecing things together. No official notes of that meeting. It's not about conspiracy. I think the overall track record speaks for itself. I think this kind of thing has been going on throughout history. Diplomacy, politics, leadership, society building and maintenance, these are dirty jobs. The confusion around the why or the whys would not seem so weird to me, even after all of that. But for one thing, the official record of the Massachusetts General Court, as recorded by author William Hubbard, states this, that they knew the murder took place on Block Island, and they knew that the Block Island natives were tributaries of the Narragansetts. But it also states, oddly enough, quote, the Pequots, not Narragansetts, not Eastern Niantics. It states, quote, the official records of the Massachusetts General Court states, quote, the Pequots treacherously and cruelly murdered Captain Stone and in treacherous-like manner slew one Mr. Oldham, end quote. Because the guilty parties fled to the Pequots for protection, that caused their guilt. Now, some question if that was even true, if they even knew it to be true for sure that the guilty parties had fled to the Pequots. But at any rate, the Massachusetts Bay Gang had another reason to justify war against the Pequots. What did John Winthrop know? Why are there no public records of interviews or evidence? There's just the indictment of the Pequots. And how do you like that? Knowing what we know about the bigger picture and how this has developed, even pulling in, again, the introduction of the concept of wampum and the interaction with the Dutch and the competition with Plymouth. I mean, putting all of these things together, it's kind of odd that really the only official statement whatsoever is that the Pequots were indicted for the murder of John Oldham. The English response was going to be pretty bold. It got everyone's attention. But that's a story for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.